Today, a simple turn to the refrigerator or pantry is often a random decision, a moment of abundance as we survey the many options. Succulent meats, colorful vegetables, sweet fruits, soft, fresh breads, dairy products, canned goods, a veritable cornucopia at our fingertips. Available year-round, regardless of the season or local harvest, thanks to global trade and technology. In the Middle Ages, this was an unfathomable fantasy for the peasant class. They had no such choice. Their existence was a constant, brutal negotiation with scarcity. They ate what was available, if anything at all, and often it was painfully, devastatingly little. The gnawing, ever-present fear of hunger was not an abstract concept. It was a daily companion, a shadow that lengthened with every failed rain, every frost, every passing army. Life was fragile, standing on the brink of collapse. One harsh winter, mercilessly lingering and depleting scarce supplies, could be devastating. A crop failure caused by pestilence, flood, drought, or pests meant a year without food supplies. The passage of an army, whether the army of one's lord or the enemy, could completely destroy the food supply of an entire village as the soldiers hunted indiscriminately, took livestock, and destroyed crops and stores. The peasants lacked those basic defenses that we take for granted. They had no suitable storage facilities, simple holes dug in the ground, crude barns easily accessible to rodents and insects, vulnerable to damp and mold. They had little or no access to trade networks through which to bring food from other regions. As roads were poor, transportation was slow and expensive, and they had no money to buy outside supplies anyway. Reliable transportation was a luxury for lords and merchants, not for common people tied to their small plot of land. So the peasants were in a state of perpetual vulnerability, completely at the mercy of climate, conflict, disease, and fate. And often, tragically often, fortune was not in their favor. When the few valuable foods they could grow or gather were exhausted, any substance that could provide the slightest heaviness in the stomach, anything that could deceive a protesting stomach for a moment, was used as sustenance. The dining surface was not a polished table, but the bare earthen floor of the hut, perhaps cleanly swept, or a low, roughly chipped bench by the hearth. The plate was usually a common earthen vessel, often cracked or chipped, which was passed around so that everyone could dip into it, or perhaps they simply ate directly from the common cauldron. The contents, usually a thin, watery broth, perhaps barely flavored with a few wild herbs or a scrap of bone, a piece of dark, unyielding bread, or maybe, if they were incredibly lucky, a boiled root picked in the field. Seasonings, flavorings other than common salt, if salt was affordable or available at all, and any culinary pleasures at all were a non-existent luxury, the domain of distant castles and monasteries. Food was not and could not be associated with gustatory pleasure or satisfaction. It was solely, cruelly aimed at preventing immediate physical collapse, at maintaining the minimum strength necessary to live another hour, another day. And often sharing in this meager meal was a common demonstration of deep, heartbreaking self-sacrifice. In families facing the abyss of hunger, the primitive instinct to protect the little ones took over. Fathers, masking their own hunger pains, deliberately gave up their meager portions in favor of the children. Mothers were fed for days on end, with only water or perhaps a gruel of boiled wild greens, their bodies exhausted as they spoon-fed their offspring. Each meager meal was carefully, painfully apportioned, counted out spoon by spoon, crumb by crumb. The guilt and shame of taking too much, of depriving a child or elderly parent of a much-needed piece of food, was a palpable emotional burden in the smoky, silent huts. Historical accounts of the worst famines paint a horrifying picture. Descriptions of the Great Famine of 1315 and 1317, which devastated much of Europe, and later descriptions of famines, such as those in 14th century France during periods of war and economic collapse, detail how entire villages lost half, and sometimes more, of their population in a single brutal winter or famine year. The living were often too weak to bury the dead. In some areas of Central Europe, especially during times of extreme, protracted hardship such as the 30 Years' War, Archaeologists have found skeletal remains with characteristic marks indicating ritual or survival-oriented cannibalism in times of extreme, unthinkable desperation. Although the finds are rarely horrific, they illustrate the desperate, taboo-breaking acts that people would do to simply preserve life. The effects of famine went far beyond the physical effects on the body. It profoundly affected all aspects of peasant existence: behavior, social structure, religious beliefs, and even the perception of time itself. The entire agricultural calendar revolved around violent, uncertain cycles of planting, growth, harvest, or crop failure, and scarcity. Periods of abundance were brief, fragile islands in a sea of want. Religious fasting, a common practice in the Middle Ages, though filled with deep spiritual meaning and penance, also served a practical, though unintended purpose. It helped ration already inadequate supplies of provisions, forcing scarce supplies to last a little longer. Subsistence was not considered an inalienable right or a guarantee of existence. It was a rare occurrence, a hard-won blessing that could disappear in an instant. The bodily costs of this constant deprivation were significant and visible. Malnourished children grew up with brittle bones prone to fracture, misshapen teeth that eroded rapidly, stunted growth, and immune systems so weakened that they collapsed at the slightest infection or common illness. Adults lived with perpetual pain, chronic fatigue that no amount of rest could relieve, and physical frailty that made them vulnerable to injury and disease. Nutritional deficiencies deteriorated not only their physical condition, but also their minds. Concentration disappeared, replaced by dull lethargy or a frenzied obsession with food. Patience wore thin, and people became more aggressive and desperate. People became more aggressive, more desperate, driven by the primal desire to survive. Nevertheless, even in the deepest hollows of despair, there were glimmers of hope, however faint. Perhaps next year's harvest would be better. The brutal winter would finally be over. A neighbor, perhaps not so desperate, would share some more of his meager supplies. That thin, fragile thread of faith, that things could get better, that survival was still possible, kept them persevering. They continued their grueling labor, continued their desperate search for food, continued to endure. Not because of the nature of the diet itself, which was often appalling, but because hunger was an inherent, expected aspect of their existence. Peasant diets were not merely inadequate or monotonous. They were often miserable, dangerous, and left deep, undeniable marks on their physique, behavior, and the entire cultural fabric of the time. These people didn't eat to live well, or to prosper, or to enjoy life. They ate, perhaps simply to continue to exist. When we imagine bread today, our minds conjure up an image of something soft, airy, golden brown, warm from the oven, perhaps exuding a pleasant aroma of yeast and baked grain, a universal symbol of nourishment, home, and comfort. Yet in the Middle Ages, for the vast majority of peasants, bread seemed an almost daily ordeal, a necessary evil rather than a pleasure. Exquisite white bread baked from fine wheat flour was a luxury reserved for the nobility, wealthy merchants, and high-ranking clergy. It was a status symbol, a sign of privilege. The common people, the peasants who tilled the fields where wheat grew, were limited to the smaller quantities of grain they could grow or acquire. They were limited to dark, dense, compact, often stone-hard breads made from barley, rye, oats, or a mixture of these, often combined with leftover grain swept from the mill floor or stored in less than perfect conditions. This mixture of poor quality grains, sometimes called olive, resulted in a loaf that was far from the image of airy white bread. And when supplies of coarser grains were depleted or yields were particularly low, any fibrous, non-digestible materials that could be found to provide volume and weight in the stomach were added to the food. These often included finely chopped straw or chaff left over from threshing, the inner bark of some trees, sawdust, often from less valuable species, dried grasses and weeds, and in the most desperate, dire circumstances, even fine sifted earth or clay. Such breads were not just unyielding, they were physically painful to eat. Their rough texture and sharp splinters broke teeth, tore gums, caused painful sores in the mouth and digestive tract, and often could not even alleviate the deep pain of hunger, only creating a temporary, false sense of satiety. They were so extremely hard that they could not be bitten into. They had to be soaked in liquid. Water, weak milk, liquid broth, diluted beer or wine to make them soft enough to chew. Even after soaking, they remained hard and were difficult to chew and digest. The bread was often consumed a few days, sometimes even a week or more after baking, already showing visible signs of mold. But recycling was out of the question. A moldy piece of bread was infinitely better than no bread at all. And not all bread was even baked in a common oven, which could be far away, require payment, or be monopolized by the Lord. In poor areas or isolated homesteads, peasants used the most primitive methods, such as placing lumps or flat discs of dough directly on hot stones or coals from a fire. The result was something that looked more like charred, brittle bricks than real nourishing food, often burned on the outside, raw and doughy on the inside, difficult to chew and digest, and containing a minimum of calories and nutrients. Bread, which today is a staple food and often symbolizes abundance on the modern table, served the medieval peasant as a perpetual, tangible reminder of scarcity, deprivation, and low status. Devoid of fine flour, effective yeast, sourdough starters existed but were less reliable with poor flour, flavorings or lightness, it simply provided a raw, undigestible heaviness in the stomach. And if fortune did smile on them that day, perhaps a few extra hours of minimal vitality for the draining labor in the fields. The most agonizing aspect of this reality, just having bread, even that poor quality, dangerous, pain-inducing bread, was considered a considerable privilege, a sign that absolute starvation had not yet arrived. Because in times of real, widespread famine, even dark, straw-filled bread became completely unavailable, and people resorted to even more desperate measures. In the Middle Ages, the average peasant rarely, if ever, saw or tasted real meat from a healthy animal killed for food. Meat was a luxury item, a source of protein and calories concentrated in the hands of the elite. What the common people got, if anything at all, were the parts the nobles, clergy, and wealthy townspeople didn't want, the leftovers after the best cuts were claimed. And even these less desirable portions did not appear often. Perhaps once a month on a feast day, perhaps much less often, depending on the generosity of the Lord or the personal circumstances of the peasant. Owning a pig was rare, and selling it more often than not. During the infrequent butchering of animals on the estate or in town, the valuable pieces, juicy legs, tender ribs, rich loin, fatty belly, went straight to the Lord's table, to the monastery refectory, or to the butcher who sold the meat to the rich. The other parts, probably intended for peasants, included internal organs: liver, kidneys, lungs, spleen, intestines, stomach, and blood. And that was only if there was something left over. If the Lord did not take everything, or if there was no special custom or obligation for the Lord to provide some scraps. When peasants managed to get their own small livestock, a scrawny chicken, the occasional pig, maybe a goat if they had land, every part of the animal was used for one simple and cruel reason: wasting any food meant jeopardizing survival. There was no room for squeamishness or preference here. Liver, with its metallic flavor and dense structure, was prepared by boiling, often with the addition of bitter wild herbs to mask the strong flavor and make it more palatable or less unpleasant. Kidneys were often roasted directly in the coals of a fire, making them tough but edible. Hearts and lungs were usually cut up and stewed in the ever-present watery broth. But the most common and perhaps the most nutritious variant obtained from the slaughter of animals was the basic sausage, made mostly of coagulated blood mixed with rendered fat, if any, and supplemented with flour made from coarse grains or cereals. It was essentially the medieval incarnation of blood pudding or black pudding. Although it may seem disgusting to modern man, it was one of the few dishes available to peasants that was high in nutrients, iron, protein, and calories. They also subjected animal heads, pigs' heads if available, to long boils, scraping off every last bit of flesh, skin, and cartilage from the bones to make thick, often jelly-like soups or stews. Tongue, cheeks, eyes, even brains were used. Large bones were systematically broken, often with heavy stones or hammers, to get to the fatty, calorie-rich marrow. Feet and hooves were boiled for hours, sometimes days, to extract all the nutrients and create a thick, gelatinous broth that solidified like jelly when cooled. The intestines were carefully cleaned, dirty, labor-intensive work, and then often stuffed with a mixture of fat, blood, and grain to make rudimentary sausages. These ingredients had an intense, often unpleasant odor when cooked, had a specific texture that was difficult to consume, and often required careful and lengthy cooking to reduce the risk of illness from parasites or bacteria. But for medieval peasants, these were the most nutrients they could realistically hope to consume. Small amounts of iron from blood, fat from bone marrow and offal, protein from organ meat, even in minuscule amounts, they had a significant impact on energy levels and overall health compared to a diet consisting solely of grains and greens. Ironically, some of these ingredients, once the dregs of medieval peasant diets, can now be found in expensive restaurants as nose-to-tail nutrition gains popularity. But for medieval peasants, this was not an adventurous culinary experiment or fashionable environmentalism. It was a matter of fundamental, desperate survival. They didn't eat these body parts for gustatory pleasure or gastronomic pleasure. They ate them because it was the only means to stay on their feet, to have the minimum strength necessary to work the fields for another day. In the Middle Ages, bread, despite its crudeness and paucity of ingredients, was one of the few constants, the basis, albeit shaky, of the peasant diet. But don't be fooled by its centrality. It wasn't always simply unpalatable. When grain spoiled due to poor storage, dampness, fungal diseases, or excessive fermentation, bread became a real, tangible poison, literally. The most famous and dreaded culprit was a fungus called ergot, Claviceps purpurea, which thrived particularly well on rye, a common peasant grain, when it was stored in damp, cool conditions. The fungus appears as purple-black growths called sclerotia, which replaced the grains on the head of rye. When the infected grain was ground into flour and then baked into bread, it released powerful, naturally occurring toxins, a group of psychoactive alkaloids related to LSD, that directly affected the human nervous system. The consequences of eating ergot-contaminated bread were horrific and often interpreted through the lens of religious or supernatural punishment. Victims suffered excruciating symptoms that ranged from severe muscle spasms and uncontrollable shivering to vivid, terrifying hallucinations, burning sensations in the limbs caused by restricted blood flow, delirium, gangrene leading to tissue necrosis, limbs literally turning black and falling off, and often ultimately death. This terrible affliction became commonly known as St. Anthony's fire, as victims often described the sensation of being burned by an internal, agonizing fire, and many sought solace or miraculous cures at shrines dedicated to St. Anthony. Outbreaks affected entire villages, leading to mass panic and interpretations of the suffering as divine punishment for sin or the work of demonic possession. People would tear their flesh in agony, dance uncontrollably and indiscriminately in the streets for days, sometimes to the point of death from exhaustion, or mutilate themselves in delirium, all after eating just a slice of bread baked from contaminated grain. There are historical accounts of entire towns or monasteries suddenly falling ill. In some cases, large-scale ergot outbreaks have surprisingly coincided with unusual mass psychological or religious phenomena, such as the infamous dancing plague in Strasbourg in 1518, when hundreds of people were seized with an uncontrollable urge to dance for days on end, many dying of exhaustion or heart attack. Many historians now suggest, based on compelling evidence, that ergot poisoning, unknowingly consumed through contaminated bread, may have been the primary biological catalyst for such widespread hysteria and inexplicable behavior. However, ergot was not the only danger lurking in a peasant's granary. Improper grain storage methods, dark, damp, unventilated pits or rough barns exposed to weather, pests, and contaminants, inevitably led to other molds, bacteria, and parasites, e.g., weevils and mites, infesting the grain. Even if the grain gave off a sour, unpleasant odor, turned black or discolored, or tasted bitter or musty when chewed, it was still ground into flour and baked. For in times of famine or acute shortage, the immediate frightening fear of disease, however severe, paled in comparison to the immediate unmistakable fear of starvation. The choice was often stark and brutally simple. Eat potentially poisoned food and get sick, or eat nothing and die. Barley, a hardy grain that is the cornerstone of low-quality bread production and the basis for many beverages, such as beer, was also highly susceptible to spoilage. If improperly stored or fermented for too long during the brewing process, beer or wort could develop thick, invisible layers of mold and harmful bacteria on it. When mixed with water, the result was a sour, often slimy mashed potato, hard to eat, giving off an unpleasant odor, but nevertheless considered food, a last-ditch effort to get calories into the body. For many peasants in times of dire need, this barley mashed potato was the only food for long periods of time. And the most heartbreaking aspect of eating tainted grains and mashed potato, the main victims were often children. Their smaller body weight, less developed digestive systems, and weak constitution reacted violently to toxins and pathogens. They suffered from high fever, excruciating abdominal pain, seizures, and terrifying hallucinations that they could not understand or articulate. However, the grim cycle was not interrupted. The same bread or mashed potatoes that caused sickness and death today would likely be eaten again tomorrow, if that was all that was left. Some historians even suggest that chronic low-level exposure to ergot toxins and other molds, regularly ingested with staple foods, may have affected medieval culture itself. Visions, auditory sensations, and other supposed divine encounters or mystical states recorded by people, especially those from poorer backgrounds, may have had a fungal origin, and altered perceptions and delusions were interpreted through pre-existing religious or supernatural frameworks, forming mystical beliefs, fueling religious factions, and even influencing apocalyptic predictions. Today, when we find a speck of mold on bread, we throw the whole loaf away without a second thought, an instinct born of modern hygiene and abundance. In the Middle Ages, however, even a moldy piece of bread, even one that was known to induce shivers or strange visions, was often regarded as a blessing, as a protection against the absolute certainty of death by starvation, regardless of the fact that it might poison or torment body and mind. For faced with the grim, binary choice between the agonizing certainty of starvation and death and the uncertain, frightening possibility of becoming ill from contaminated food, many chose the latter out of sheer necessity. When hunger reached its absolute zenith, when the barns were empty, the fields cleared, the last roots eaten, and even moldy bread finished, the peasants entered the most brutal and agonizing phase of survival, consuming what under no circumstances was considered food in the ordinary sense of the word. During the harshest winters, prolonged warfare that disrupted planting and harvesting campaigns, or widespread plague that decimated populations and left fields unmaintained, people resorted to consuming whatever non-food items they could physically obtain and ingest. This included foraging for food on a desperate scale, as empty stomachs took precedence over instincts and knowledge. Grass, dry leaves gathered from the forest floor, bark stripped from living or dead trees, bitter roots dug from frozen or barren ground, moss stripped from rocks or trees, and even clay were all consumed not out of desire or even mild hunger, but out of deep, bone-deep, agonizing desperation when there was literally nothing else left. Tree bark, usually the inner, softer layer, cambium, was stripped from trees, most often pine or birch if they were available, as they contained minimal amounts of starch. This bark was then boiled in water for hours and sometimes days in an attempt to break down the tough fibers and make it a little softer, resulting in a fibrous, almost unpalatable porridge or soup. Although the bark provided some bulk and a paltry number of calories, most of the time it served as a mere weight in the stomach, incredibly difficult to digest and providing little or no nutrition. Leaves and wild herbs were boiled in water, adding a pinch of precious salt, if any, or simply chewed raw. Their bitter juice and tough fibers only served to distract from hunger pains. Moss was gathered and added to meager soups or stews for bulkiness, but it had little nutritional value. Clay was either swallowed by handfuls or mixed with water to make a slurry in the desperate, misguided belief that it would ease the hunger in the stomach by filling the void. Predictably, the human body reacted violently and negatively to this desperate, unnatural diet. Consumption of indigestible fiber, bark, moss, and clay led to serious digestive disorders, excruciating diarrhea, uncontrollable vomiting, and dangerous intestinal blockages. The body, desperate for nutrients, struggled to process these foreign substances, often brutally purging itself of them. However, historical records and the accounts of chroniclers who witnessed the famine indicate that the intense discomfort and pain of these symptoms were often, horrifyingly, less excruciating than the unbearable suffering of an empty stomach and the slow, gnawing process of starvation. During widespread and prolonged famines, historical accounts tell of families boiling leather goods, shoes, belts, saddle parts, pieces of leather armor, in an attempt to extract any remaining protein or fat. Anything that could be scraped off, softened by prolonged boiling and brought down was eaten, even if it was covered with dirt, dried blood, animal waste, or mold. The smell of boiling skin must have been horrifying and the taste unimaginable. Archaeological evidence, particularly the analysis of coprolites, fossilized human feces, recovered from sites of medieval famine or extreme poverty, has even revealed the presence of undigested materials such as wood chips, undigested wild plant seeds, and even textile fibers. Concrete, physical evidence of the absolute unthinkable lengths to which people were forced to go in order to ingest anything that might delay death. Children suffered the most in these times of extreme despair. Their small, vulnerable bodies simply could not cope with the lack of food and the consumption of indigestible, toxic substances. Many babies died of starvation and related illnesses before reaching their first birthday. Those who survived these early years often grew up with severe, irreversible physical impairments, stunted growth, skeletal deformities, e.g., rickets from vitamin D deficiency exacerbated by malnutrition, severely decayed teeth, the result of poor nutrition, lack of hygiene, and the physically damaging nature of the food they ate. All visible, long-term evidence of a diet born in the most extreme desperation. And yet life, one way or another, had to go on. The cycle of work, however weakened, had to continue for those who could still stand on their feet. Hunger provided no respite for grief, no respite for mourning lost children or family members. For the medieval peasantry, it was not a rare, isolated tragedy. It was a recurring, looming element of existence, an expected hardship that came with terrifying regularity in one generation and another. Every peasant understood to his bones that at some time, in some year, famine was likely to come to his house, and hunger, when it came, was not interested in your eating habits or your dignity. It was simply assessing how much you were willing to endure, what depths of degradation and suffering you were willing to plunge into before your body finally succumbed. Nowadays, turning on the tap to drink a glass of clean, safe drinking water is an automatic, unconscious action for billions of people, a convenience so fundamental that we hardly realize it. In the Middle Ages, the very act of scooping water from an easily accessible source could mean mortal danger. Rivers, public wells, and streams, especially those near population centers, were frequently and heavily polluted. They served as convenient but deadly dumping grounds for human excrement, urine and livestock waste, decomposing animal carcasses, general garbage, and untreated sewage, especially near villages, monasteries, and nascent cities. Although the peasants had no scientific understanding of germs, bacteria, and disease transmission, they were well aware from bitter experience that drinking unclean water could be deadly. They knew that water from certain springs, or water that looked cloudy or smelled bad, often led to excruciating illness and death. The most common and widely accepted solution to this widespread problem was the widespread consumption of small beer, a weak ale brewed at home from boiled grains such as barley, oats, or wheat. It was not for recreation or intoxication. It had a very low alcohol concentration, typically between 0.5% and 2.5%, much lower than modern beer. However, the minimal alcohol content, combined with the boiling process during brewing, was enough to kill or greatly reduce the amount of harmful bacteria and pathogens present in the water used, making it much safer to drink than ordinary, untreated water. This small beer was usually cloudy or murky in appearance, served at room temperature, cellars were a bit cooler, and often had a sour or slightly vinegary taste due to the brewing process and possible contamination. Nevertheless, it was a staple drink for everyone from the oldest villager to the youngest child. Yes, as surprising as it may sound to modern ears, children as young as 2 or 3 years old, and in some cases even recently weaned infants, drank a little beer during the morning meal and throughout the day. This was not a tradition or some bizarre medieval parental choice. It was a fundamental survival instinct, a calculated choice in favor of the safest liquid. In a typical family, a barrel of small beer could be brewed to last for a week, and everyone, regardless of age or position in the family, drank from it throughout the day. In moderation, beer did not intoxicate adults, but it did provide hydration, and the risk of contracting waterborne diseases was greatly reduced compared to drinking directly from a contaminated source. There were other limited options for moisturizing. Diluted vinegar mixed with water, known to the Romans as pusca, and probably similar variations used later, served as a kind of medieval tart lemonade whose acidity helped kill some pathogens. Weak herbal infusions or teas of brewed chamomile, sage, mint, or other common herbs were also used, but not just because of flavor or supposed medicinal properties, but because people believed that the boiling process and the herbs themselves helped purify the liquid. Water itself was only consumed without purification in extreme cases, often when no other liquid was available, and even then it was often drunk cautiously, recognizing the risks. Those who had the means or access to sufficient firewood could boil water to make it safer, but not every peasant household had enough fuel, time, or large enough cooking vessels to heat significant amounts of water just for drinking for the whole family throughout the day. Therefore, many peasants simply accepted the risks associated with water sources and suffered devastating consequences. Waterborne diseases were a constant, silent killer in medieval communities, often escalating into devastating epidemics. Dysentery, cholera, typhoid, and various parasitic infections were widespread. Disease outbreaks could wipe out entire villages or neighborhoods in cities with terrifying speed. Children, especially vulnerable to dehydration, could die within days. The simple and necessary act of quenching thirst could inadvertently lead to a slow, agonizing death accompanied by fever, vomiting, and debilitating diarrhea. In cities where populations were denser and sanitation was virtually non-existent by modern standards, conditions were even worse. Waste was thrown directly onto narrow streets, mixed with rainwater, and drained into the same streams, rivers, and wells from which drinking water was drawn. Basic sewage systems were virtually non-existent. Houses downstream from markets, stables, slaughterhouses, and tanneries often had the most polluted water sources, but people continued to use them as needed. And yet existence went on, adapting. Weak beer became a fundamental ingrained element of medieval daily life, a necessity woven into the fabric of life. It was not a luxury or a choice made for pleasure. It was a defense against unseen threats, a practical response to a dangerous environment. Women, traditionally the brewers of the family, played a vital role in public health, albeit unknowingly. They had vital knowledge of recipes, the necessary duration of fermentation, and proper storage methods to ensure that beer was safe and did not sour prematurely, making it undrinkable or even toxic. Today, our drinking water is a marvel of modern technology and public health. Clear, purified, readily available, and reliable. But for the medieval peasant, the contents of the cup constantly carried the potential for life and death, the possibility of poisoning and agonizing illness, or the possibility of preservation and another day of survival. When one considers all that was presented, unyielding, straw-stuffed bread, liquid, tasteless stone soup, bad-tasting, potentially poisonous herbs and bark, disgusting, often rotten offal, tainted water or weak, sour beer, one question becomes not just relevant, but inescapable. How did their bodies manage to survive? How did generation after generation of peasants endure a diet that was not only insufficiently nutritious, but often contaminated and physically harmful? The answer is grim but simple. The medieval peasant's body had no choice but to endure. It either adapted, becoming incredibly resistant to deprivation and toxins, or it died, often in childhood, taking its less hardy genetic code with it. And this adaptation was both physical and, most likely, biological, a form of natural selection through cycles of starvation, disease, and deprivation. Their digestive tracts probably became more robust, more able to process roughage, low-quality protein, and small contaminants. Their gut microbiota, the complex ecosystem of bacteria in the gut, evolved to cope with the constant influx of mold, parasites, and impurities that would make a modern digestive system run riot. Their immune systems were constantly under attack from unsanitary conditions, chronic malnutrition, and exposure to pathogens. And only the toughest individuals with innate or acquired resilience survived the dangerous years of childhood and adolescence and reproduced. This physique was not aesthetically pleasing by modern standards. It was often thin, wiry, marked by deficits and chronic disease, often slouching from tireless physical labor, with rough skin and haggard facial features. But he possessed an incredible, almost unfathomable resilience. He resisted pain, chronic hunger, debilitating fatigue, and constant infections with a tenacity that seems superhuman to us. Not because he was inherently stronger, but because he was forged and hardened in the crucible of unrelenting deprivation and scarcity. Now imagine the modern physique, the body of the average person in the developed world. It is shaped by predictable daily routines, access to an unprecedented variety of dietary foods, consistent freshness and safety standards, and readily available supplements and medications. Our digestive systems are accustomed to easily digestible, highly processed foods. A slight change in eating habits, the introduction of unfamiliar or not-so-clean foods, and we immediately experience abdominal bloating, fatigue, digestive discomfort, or worse. One glass of inadequately filtered or questionable quality water, and we are likely to become ill with debilitating symptoms. We become irritable. We can't concentrate. Our mood plummets if our midday meal is delayed by just 2 hours. We rely on refrigeration, on airtight packaging, on expiration dates, on a vast infrastructure of food safety and distribution that is completely alien to the medieval experience. Could we, with our modern, less experienced bodies and minds, survive a week on the typical diet of a medieval peasant in a time of scarcity? On moldy bread mixed with straw, watery broth, questionable offal, leftovers, and weak, sour beer? The harsh reality is that modern technology, agricultural advances, and healthcare systems have provided us with unprecedented comfort, safety, and protection from the harsh realities that have defined much of human history. But perhaps unintentionally, this comfort has also made us less resilient, less adaptable, and more vulnerable to the major threats that were commonplace to our ancestors. We certainly have better nutrition, longer average life expectancy, and freedom from the constant gnawing pain of chronic hunger. But we may have far less ability to survive if the complex systems that maintain our comfortable lives ever fail. And if that comfort were ever to disappear, if the shelves were empty and the taps dried up, the question would ring with frightening clarity. Would you be able to consume what they consumed, drink what they drank, endure the constant physical pain and psychological burden of scarcity? And more importantly, would you have been able to survive as they did, finding a way to persevere when everything seemed designed to break you? Because in the end, they ate as much as we did, perhaps in volume, though the caloric content of the food was much lower and the quality was appalling. They consumed whatever was humanly possible, whatever offered any chance of survival. And perhaps, in our abundance, we have simply grown accustomed to the impossible, to the easy availability of safe, nutritious food, losing touch with the brutal reality that survival for most of history was an agonizing daily struggle measured in moldy crumbs and tainted water.